Good afternoon, everybody. Hi, I'm Jonathan, your resident astronomer. I'm grateful to you for coming out this afternoon. And I wanted to share with you some fun stories, some really fascinating look at some things that went on back in the 1960s. Those of us, there was probably a few of us in here who remember the 1960s. The kids nowadays, they say, how could you possibly, we couldn't possibly have gone to the moon with 1960s technology. They didn't have cell phones, they didn't have calculators. Well, I'm going to show you how we got to the moon with 1960s technology and 1950s technology. And what I'm going to be concentrating on primarily is behind the scenes at Kennedy Space Center, because I always felt that mission control and the astronauts got, of course, they deserved a lot of attention. They got a lot of attention, but the folks who worked at Kennedy Space Center, there were 24,000 of them that worked there during the Apollo era. And they like to call themselves a bunch of nobodies who got amazing things done, and I wanted to tell you some of their stories. In July 24th, 1950, 12-year-old Jim Ogle was cast netting for mullet in the Banana River off of Cape Canaveral, and he heard this strange whooshing sound, and he looked up in the sky and saw this contrail. And he wasn't sure what he had seen, but he knew it was something unusual. And then the next morning, he found out in the newspaper that he had just seen the first launch from Cape Canaveral, July 24th, 1950. It was a converted V-2 rocket with a second stage added on to it. How was Jamie Ogle, 12 years old at that time, to know that 19 years later he was going to be sitting in the firing room for Apollo 11 and launching mankind's first mission to the moon? So he had that kind of connection. These are the kind of people I had a chance to talk to over the last 10 years and hear their stories about what it was like to work there. One of the things that I wanted to talk about too is Kennedy Space Center itself is really just a remarkable engineering achievement. When President Kennedy made his announcement in May of 1961 that we were going to go to the moon, all we had was Cape Canaveral, which was this green area here. And so the government procured everything that's in white, which now became the Kennedy Space Center. And over the course of the next 4 or 5 years, there was a civil engineering project to make Kennedy Space Center that was equivalent in scale to constructing the Panama Canal. And most people don't realize that it was that big an engineering effort. This was taking a bunch of orange groves in people's houses and turning it into a functioning spaceport. So in 1961, the United States just had these launch towers that are along the coast on Cape Canaveral, and within 5 years, this is the launch of one of the Gemini launches, and you can see in the background there's a Saturn V sitting on a launch pad that hadn't even been conceived of 5 years before this launch took place. So they had already constructed the launch pads and all the technology, built them, designed them, and built them around a rocket. Again, all of this not having been conceived of, and all done without computers. This was all done with traditional drafting and engineering techniques, throwing a lot of people at this project, obviously, to make things work. But this is what scheduling looked like. And on a smaller scale, what they would do in some meetings would do one of these kind of schedules, throw it in the back of the project manager's VW, drive it over to the Photoshop, have them take pictures of that magnetic board, and then pass that schedule around the next morning for their project meetings. That's the way we kept track of schedules to build Kennedy Space Center and build the program here. And it was an extremely tight schedule, obviously, to try to make this audacious goal of getting people to the moon. This gentleman here was Don Phillips, who later became one of the launch supervisors. He told me a story about how hard they were working. He said one night they had been pulling a test, and he'd been probably on console for almost 24 hours, and it was 4 o'clock in the morning. He was driving home, just completely bleary-eyed and exhausted. He said, I remembered seeing a vulture in the road and didn't think too much about it. And the next morning when I woke up, I was covered with blood. My wife was freaked out. He was covered with blood. He went outside and discovered that not only had he seen that vulture, but he had actually hit it and had gone through the windshield of his car and was dead in the backseat of his car, and he didn't even realize that he'd hit the vulture. He just woke up the next morning. That's how exhausted he was. That's what the kind of dedication that these folks put into building the facility there. One of the other things I didn't really understand about what it was like to work there was that when you look at the Apollo Saturn V, you have the Saturn V rocket in the middle. There are two major components to that. There's the spacecraft, which was the part that went to the moon. That's on the left. all the people that worked on the spacecraft side of thing reported to Houston. And then there was the launch vehicle, the Saturn V on the right-hand side. Everybody that worked on that reported to Marshall Space Flight Center. And so it was like inter-family rivalry between these two groups of people. They both made fun of each other as to how much they thought the other group was goofing off or getting too much attention or whatever it was. So there was the sibling rivalry that was going on at Kennedy Space Center, but the idea was to put it together to make this big rocket. And so what I decided to do was to follow in the 6-month period between all these components were being assembled in factories all across the United States, and then they came to Kennedy Space Center 6 months before a scheduled launch. So for Apollo 11, which launched in July of 1969, all of these pieces showed up or started showing up at Kennedy Space Center in January of 1969, and here's how some of them got there. This was the Super Guppy airplane, which NASA still uses. It was converted Boeing cargo plane. They built this big bulbous thing over the top of it. You could actually put the upper stage of a rocket in that, or in this case, this is how the lunar module got to Kennedy Space Center from Grumman in Bethpage, New York. It came in boxes like this. So that's one way some of the things got to Kennedy. The part that covered the lunar module was built by Boeing in Wichita, and that was helicoptered in and landed in the parking lot outside the assembly building for that. This was a building that a lot of people don't know about. You know, we've all seen pictures of the vehicle assembly building, that huge behemoth of a structure that's 550 feet tall. The spacecraft was assembled in this building, which was at the time was called the Manned Spacecraft Operations Building, and it's now the Neil Armstrong Operations and Checkout Building. But this is still in use today. Lockheed Martin is using this to build the Orion spacecraft. But this is where all the spacecraft assembly took place. And so the bits of the Apollo capsule came in as they were uncrated. This is what the service module that would carry all of the oxygen and fuel to supply the command module, which is still wrapped up in its wrapping paper there over on the back corner. So this has come in from California into the MSOB. And then the lunar module came in like this, again, having been uncrated, coming in from Bethpage, New York. And one of the engineers I was talking to was working on this. He said they always made it sound like they were supposed to ship it to us. It was supposed to be ready to assemble and go right out there. And he said, basically, it all came to us with some assembly required. You know, they would send this stuff, and then they would send a whole another shipment, which was full of all the spare parts and things that they had forgotten or hadn't had the time to install on it yet. And so there was a lot of assembly that happened at Kennedy Space Center. So this would have been happening right around January as the spacecraft was coming in. The operations and checkout building had these two huge altitude chambers, and these were chambers where you could pump the air out of, and you could simulate being in pretty much a near vacuum at 200,000 feet. And what they did was actually assemble the spacecraft inside these altitude chambers. And so one was for the lunar module and one was for the command and service module. The lunar module being the part that landed, the command and service module being the part that carried the astronauts and then eventually came back to Earth. So it was, again, very, very busy period. As we got towards the end of the 1960s, there were 3 Apollo missions in processing at the same time. This is, right now, you'll see, that's Apollo 11 coming out of the assembly facility, and this is Apollo 12 in front of it, ready to go right into the altitude chamber. So they put the service module in, and then the command module will come in. And this is a surprise to some people because the pictures you see of the command module when it's in orbit around the moon, the command module is silver. This is what it looked like when it arrived at Kennedy Space Center. There's a silver and gold tape that's on it, but then there's a blue plastic covering over that. And so it looked blue like this until it got out to the launch pad, and then they carefully peeled all of that layer of plastic covering for the tape off of that. So what they're doing here is they've got a crane and they're lowering it into the, at the very bottom here is the altitude chamber. That's the lid for the altitude chamber sitting on the side there. You know, I was talking to the guy that designed this facility, and he said, yeah, the thing would kind of just bubble a little bit when they repressurized it. They didn't bother to bolt the lid down because the vacuum would pull it closed. But once it got inside the altitude chamber, this is what it looked like. This is a test that was going on in there. The command module is here. There are some work platforms that fold down around it. You can see an astronaut who's getting ready to go inside the cabin and do a test. What they would do with this is, you know, of course, make sure that everything in here was completely airtight and was going to function when it got out into space and out into orbit around the moon. So the astronauts would go inside there. They would practice depressurizing the altitude chamber so that there was like a vacuum around them. They could do a simulated launch that way. There were 2 guys that rode inside the altitude chamber in case anything went wrong. They could immediately call for things to get repressurized and go in and rescue the astronauts and help them if they had to. Fortunately, nothing like that ever happened. This is maybe, had something like this been available, or I mean, this was available in Apollo 1, but that was, if there had been a fire, it would have happened inside the altitude chamber had it not happened out at the launch pad. The other thing that happened in the altitude chamber as they were assembling this is now it's a time for the command module, which was built in California, to meet the lunar module, which was built by a different contractor in New York. And so here is what they called a docking test. So the command module is down in the altitude chamber, and they've taken the top of the lunar module, flipped it upside down, and now they're going to lower it into the altitude chamber. And so here's the docking probe as the 2 of them are checking. You're testing the fit here because this is the first time these 2 spacecraft have ever seen each other. And the next time they see each other, they're going to be on the way to the moon going 25,000 miles an hour. So if it doesn't work, you better find out while it's on the ground rather than when it's 25,000 it's 25,000 miles away from Earth and going away faster than that. So they would do these kind of tests, practice, again, depressurizing things and make sure that there was a good fit between the 2, the command module and the lunar module. The lunar module took a lot of additional assembly when it got to the Kennedy Space Center. Here they are testing the legs, folding them in. There's all this gold and silver mylar insulation that's all over the lunar module, and a lot of that was installed after it got to Kennedy Space Center. Here they are testing the lunar rover. This was the first time the lunar rover had been near the lunar module. The lunar rover was built by Boeing in Alabama, and so now they're testing the communications between the astronauts and the lunar rover and the lunar module. And you can see the back of the lunar module is open. You can see the battery compartment in the back of it, all this empty stuff that still hasn't been filled in yet. And a lot of that wouldn't be installed until the vehicle was out at the launch pad, which was just an amazing thing to me to find out that all this work was still going on after they'd rolled it out to the launch pad. So what would normally happen, they'd go through the tests, make sure everything worked, and then the lunar module gets lowered into the adapter. And this is what's going on here. They're lowering it in with a crane. This is the back of the lunar module, again, completely exposed. All of the shielding that would have gone around that still hadn't been installed yet. Then they lower this adapter over. This is the part that flew in by helicopter. And now the command and service module, which is ready, is lifted by crane and is put on top of that adapter. And so now you have a complete command and service module and lunar module that are all together. And it gets rolled out by truck out to the vehicle assembly building. So that's how the spacecraft assembly happened. And this would have all been done within the first couple of months of July of 1969. And so they would come into the vehicle assembly building and wait to be put on top of the Saturn V rocket. So the vehicle assembly building, again, I think it's pictures we've all seen in it's been around and been the workhorse of assembling rockets at Kennedy Space Center ever since the Apollo era. They assembled the space shuttle there, and they're right now have the Artemis rocket under assembly there. It's a huge building. At the time it was built, the highest point in Florida was the roof of the building there. It's about 550 feet tall. This is what it looks like. You probably recognize it from having seen it before. The Launch Control Center is down at the bottom. And it had these 4 huge, what they call the high bays. And you can see one in cross-section here. Each of the high bays was big enough to hold the Statue of Liberty on its pedestal and still have plenty of room left over. So you could have put 4 statues of Liberty inside the vehicle assembly building and still had lots of room left. It's big enough that it has its own weather. There's talk about, sometimes it rains in there. Some people said maybe not rain, but at least very heavy humidity. Vultures get in there, and they have to try to get them out of there. I learned from somebody that vultures don't like riding in high-speed elevators. It's a little piece of information that might come in handy to one of you one of these days. So, but all the pieces would come together, and we'll see some things that you've probably seen before. But the big parts of the rocket, the big parts of the Saturn V, came in by barge from California and then also from Michoud and Huntsville. So this is the second stage of a Saturn V being brought in. And the biggest part of it, the F1 engines on the first stage, this is the business end of the Saturn V, getting ready to get stacked. They have this big aisle down the middle of it, and then they would raise it vertically and move it into position. And so to raise it vertically, you had to have a huge, heavy crane. And this is a picture I took 7 years ago. The crane is still in use. They've upgraded it slightly. What I really liked about this was this is a ballast tank. This is filled with water to simulate the weight of a Saturn V or of a rocket. And so to test the operators of the crane, who are in a cab that's at the very top of this thing, they're 550 feet up in the air. The crane operators had to be able to lower this ballast tank to be able to operate the nozzle of a spray paint can on the floor, or to be able to set it down onto an egg so that you couldn't pull the egg out and you didn't crack the egg. And so this is all manually. This was without computers. They were just relying on people giving them radio calls. And of course, the crane has been upgraded substantially and is much more precise in its operation now than it was then. But again, just think about what working in that kind of environment must have been like. So some pictures you've probably seen. Here's the crane now lifting the first stage up. It goes up over a big aperture into one of the side high bays. And once it's been put onto the launch platform, I love this picture because these are guys working inside the engine compartment. This is Apollo 12 that's being built right here. And so these guys are working inside the engine compartment on the first stage. Underneath the first stage, you saw those big engines. What people didn't realize, and I didn't know until I had started researching the book that I was working on, was that those engines get wrapped in insulation. This is Inconel foil insulation that's wrapped on there and then sewn on with Inconel lock wire. And talked to one of the guys that did that and said nobody liked doing that job because the foil and the wire would just cut you to pieces as you were trying to sew this stuff around the engines. But it insulated them during the heat of launch. Another not so well-known story was the spool, which was this monstrosity. North American Rockwell was building the second stage of the Saturn V. The first stage had been designed and built. The third stage had been designed and built. And the second stage, which was what was needed to get the Saturn V up into orbit, to get the Apollo up into orbit, that had to, because there were constraints on the weight, they had to continually shave down the second stage, and they were having difficulties with that design. And so when it came time to do a test fitting of the Saturn V for the Apollo 4 mission, the second stage wasn't ready yet. So Rockwell shipped them this thing, which is the same diameter as the second stage, and it just has a spool down the middle that the wires could pass through. So they actually put this on top of the first stage, and then they put the third stage on top of it, just so they could test the connection behind it. But they said the contractors had this tremendous rivalry. None of them wanted to be the one that was the long pole in the tent. Nobody wanted to hold up the show. So Rockwell came up with this so that they wouldn't be the ones that held things up. But they'd say the Boeing and the McDonnell Douglas people would say like, hey, beautiful stage there, Rockwell. You guys did a great job with that. But eventually the second stage did arrive, and this is what that looks like, being stacked onto the top of the first one. The third stage comes in. And this one is a bunch of IBM technicians standing around inside the instrument unit waiting for the spacecraft to come in. Talked to the guy who was the head of IBM at the time. He said it was hard to find IBM guys who would actually be able to bolt things together. They were much more used to dealing with the computer side of things. But IBM designed the mechanism that was the computer that helped steer the rocket once it was on its way into outer space. This picture I love because I think it's just a really beautiful and dramatic picture. This is the lunar module is up in the adapter here. You can see its legs hanging down, and it's still wrapped in plastic. You can see some work platforms up inside there and a guy standing down here waiting for the lunar module to come down on top of it. So again, the Saturn V, it was really huge. The first and second stage were 33 feet in diameter. The third stage was 22 feet in diameter. So you've got a lot of empty space actually inside that. This is one of the work platforms. This is inside the third stage of the Saturn V. They've got temporary work platforms in there. Ron Evans is an astronaut. He's the gentleman in the dark clothes there who's talking to one of the technicians. One of the guys I was talking to said when this thing was out at the launch pad, he remembered one day going through a test and he saw at lunchtime, suddenly saw a bunch of technicians walking across the swing arm out into the third stage of the Saturn V, and he was like, there's not supposed to be a test going on in here. And he followed them out and went in there, and it turned out they had a table set up, and they were playing cards on the work platforms inside the Saturn V out at the launch pad during lunchtime for their lunch break, because it was a nice air-conditioned space to hang out in Florida. So just to think that that you've got a vehicle that's big enough, a rocket that's big enough to be able to work in there with this kind of room is really kind of interesting. A test that was really fascinating to me as well was the Saturn V. Okay, so you think about, you've got a 363-foot rocket. If you think about trying to stand a pencil on its end, if there's any vibration, the tip of the pencil is going to go back and forth a lot. And the design specification was that the very top end of the Saturn V couldn't go more than about the diameter of a basketball if there was any wind or anything like that. So they needed to design a system that if the thing started rocking, it would dampen the rocking. And this is the elaborate method that they used to test that dampening system. This is a test vehicle. This was not an actual flight-worthy Saturn V. So how do you get a rocket rocking? This is I guess better to find out in this kind of condition. And this is the system that's supposed to stop it from vibrating so much. But I'm wondering what the test document on this looked like. Okay. So it did its job, but it was funny going back and when I found this video, going back and showing some of the launch vehicle people about this. It was like they didn't remember this test, but obviously it got done, and we finally figured out exactly what it was that it was supposed to be measuring. But eventually, the spacecraft gets on top of there, and now it's time to roll the Saturn V out to the launch pad. And so it went out to the launch pad about 2 months before the launch was actually going to happen. This is Apollo 11 leaving the vehicle assembly building the morning that it was rolling out to the launch pad. And to get a sense of scale, you can see the engineer standing down here at the bottom, just absolutely mammoth. The launch platform and the big tower that held up the rocket all rolled out on this crawler vehicle, which is just immense, and went out to the launch pad. It took about the better part of a day to roll out there at about 1.5 miles per hour and get put up and installed at the launch pad. Again, a technology that was designed based on earth-moving equipment, this crawler was. And this whole area around here, this all used to be just marshland. It was all compacted and filled and turned into launch pads that are still in use today. SpaceX uses this launch pad right now. One thing that didn't get many pictures taken, most of us saw the pictures of the Saturn V gleaming white next to its launch tower, but then there was this ungainly, ugly thing called the mobile service structure. And this actually surrounded the Saturn V most of the time it was out at the launch pad. This is a way for engineers and technicians to get up and down and work on the spacecraft out at the launch pad. This one was known for being a little on the unreliable side. They had to put counterweights on it to keep it from falling over. It had an elevator which some of the engineers I talked to said was prone to stopping in somewhere on the way up to the upper level, just stopping and then the doors opening, and then suddenly you're looking out into open space several hundred feet down. People did not necessarily enjoy riding in that very much, but it got the job done. And again, I mentioned doing work at the launch pad. This is a diagram of some of the platforms that were around the lunar module while it was being worked on out at the pad. Again, thinking about how fast these things had to happen, Apollo 10 had just launched to the moon. It hadn't even gotten to the moon yet, and 2 days later they rolled Apollo 11 out to the launch pad. So we didn't even know if Apollo 10 was going to be successful, and Apollo 11 was already out at the launch pad. Apollo 12 was under construction, and Apollo 13 was just starting to go through processing at that time. So we were trying to get as many shots at the moon as we possibly could in the last half of 1969. If Apollo 11 hadn't landed in July, Apollo 12 was going to try in September. If Apollo 12 didn't make it in September, then Apollo 13 was going to try in November. So we had 3 shots at the moon in the last half of 1969 to meet the president's goal. One of the gentlemen I interviewed who was a technician who worked on the lunar module, showed me a very unusual picture, this is him inside the lunar module. Neil Armstrong decided that he didn't like the way the way they were supposed to land was when these contact probes on the lunar module's leg touched the ground, they're supposed to shut off the engine and the lunar module would drop the final 10 feet to the lunar surface. Armstrong didn't like the idea of turning off the engine before he'd actually gotten to the ground. And unfortunately, they hadn't designed the insulation to protect the lunar module from the heat of keeping the engine on the whole time it went down to the ground. So they had to install what ended up being 39 pounds of additional insulation on the vehicle once it had gotten out to the launch pad. And what I thought was interesting was putting 39 pounds of foil on there meant that they would either have to take 39 pounds off somewhere else in the spacecraft, or else they would have to use another 15,600 pounds of fuel to get them to the moon. That's how much fuel it takes you to get to the moon. So 39 pounds turns to an extra 15,600. That's why Grumman had an incentive. They got money for every pound they could shave off of the weight of the lunar module. But he said his tools were a stapler, tape, and scissors. And they would weigh. He'd go into before he got into the lunar module. They'd weigh his work kit, and when he got out, they would weigh it again, and that was how much he had added to the weight of the vehicle during the course of the day. And again, very, very carefully controlled to do that. But he said he was working in there, and this guy was walking around with a Polaroid camera and said, "Hey kid, you want your picture taken?" And so he, why not? And so he still has that to this day, this Polaroid camera photo. Another picture of one of the things that happened just before launch was these 2 gentlemen from Grumman who were installing one of the name plaques. This one is for Apollo 16. This is the plaque that's on the leg. If you remember, Armstrong and Aldrin opened it up as they got on the moon and said, "Here men from the planet Earth first set a foot upon the moon." That was installed just before launch. And so here they are installing the one on the leg of Apollo 16. Working out at the pad, when you're talking about some things that are 500 feet up in the air, they said that was a great way to test rookies, was to take them up on the highest part of the elevator and make them walk out on the launch platform 550 feet up in the air and see how they reacted to it. I'm not sure I would pass that test. This is, you can see this gentleman working on top of the white room. This is the place where the astronauts would get into the spacecraft. This is in January of 1970 for Apollo 14. So he's working up there at night. This is the same view for Apollo 11 during the daytime. So you can see this guy's got nerves of steel to be working up there that high up off the ground. Some fun things that I got to see as a result of getting to meet some folks and go through the launch facilities down there were the rubber room, or the blast room. And so there was an escape system built. If there was some sort of a fuel leak on the launch pad while they were in the process of getting the vehicle ready to go, the technicians could go down into the mobile launcher and jump into this tube and ride down like basically a long slide into this area that was called the rubber room, and then the blast room, and then they could ride out an explosion. And so this is a view of the rubber room and the launch. So here's how the guys would do it. You had to get rubber room certified if you were going to work on the vehicle at the launch pad. So here's a BBC reporter trying it out. in 1969. So you'd slide down. Now you're underneath the launch pad. You're surrounded by tens of feet of concrete. Go into a blast room. That's a missile silo type door there. Lock the door behind you, and then you and your friends can ride out the conflagration in the comfort of these chairs. Not a very glamorous facility. I got to see what it looked like. It was certainly not glamorous 50 years afterward. That's the sanitary facilities behind me there. You've got a curtain and a chemical toilet. This has been preserved. It's not available to the public now. This was the one that's on Launch Pad 39A that SpaceX owns now. SpaceX has to maintain this as a national historic site, but they can't do anything to take it apart. But it is down there, but you can't get to it anymore. Another fun way to get off of the launch tower if something went wrong was the slide wire system. I was talking to the guys that designed this. They said when the first ones they were trying to come up with how do you get off the top of the launch tower. And they said, well, we tried a thing on the vehicle assembly building where we strung wires from the roof down to the ground, and they had like a T-bar system that you would hold on to. And this guy said that that when we were testing the system out, they would bring in these full-size dummies in laundry carts. And he said after 2 or 3 days, the dummies were coming in missing arms or legs or heads. And he said, he decided that maybe that was not something he wanted to try out on his own. So they came up with this one system that they only tested one time and never actually had to use in the process. But it would take you out to the perimeter of the launch pad area where you can then get into a bunker. Another fun story of what it was like to work at the launch pad was as they were doing a fueling test for Apollo 13 one evening, and this was at night, the security guards were driving around and they noticed this strange cloud. It suddenly was very cloudy or foggy. 3 vehicles stopped there to investigate what was going on. Couldn't see anything. They got back in the car, turned the ignition on, and the engines exploded. The pistons went flying through the tops of the motors and out through the hoods. What had happened was they were in a cloud of oxygen. There was an oxygen drain pond from their liquid oxygen, and so the cars melted. And luckily, nobody was hurt in that, but it made for quite an interesting display here of what could happen, again, in a very hazardous environment that looked benign for these officers as they were driving through it. Talking a little bit more about 1960s technology, this is part of the computer systems that helped launch the vehicle. This is a 4-bit flip-flop. And so there were literally thousands of these boards in the launch vehicle computer. They had a computer inside, the test computer. There was a computer inside each of the firing rooms, and then there was one out in the mobile launchers. And the computers talked to each other. Very rudimentary programming. They had, I think, a total of 32K of memory, so not a lot of memory by modern standards. In fact, in the spacecraft testing area, they had to start delaying how they did some of their testing because they ran out of system memory. They only had 32K of memory in the spacecraft thing, and so they could only run a test that would run for maybe 45 minutes or an hour, have to stop, dump everything out of the computer, and then start the test all over again. And it took them a year to get enough budget to be able to buy another 32K of memory. And of course, we all remember these cards programming. The engineers all had these control panels, and these were all individual to the system that was being done in the Launch Control Center. And so you'll see the switches say on, auto, and off. The idea was that you ultimately wanted the computer to control things, and so you would leave the switches in the auto position. But most of the engineers didn't trust that, and so they wanted the ability to be able to turn the computer on or off. And in fact, they needed to do that because they had a lot of breakdowns with the computer in the initial years. But eventually, the computers became more reliable. But the computing power itself was basically to turn on relays or turn off relays. And so there was all of these things that, the computer would send a command out to the computer out in the launch pad, which then activated relays that were connected to the launch vehicle or to the systems that were supporting that. And rather than reprogramming the terminals, this is how you reprogrammed the computer, was through these kind of patch panels that were common in the telephone industry, obviously. So here's the Launch Control Center. A lot of people get this confused with Mission Control. Mission Control is just a few rows of consoles, and there's only about 24 people in there. The firing rooms in the Launch Control Center have about, there were 400 consoles in there, so there are about 450 people who were working in their monitoring systems. I actually own the control panel that guy was sitting in front of. They got surplused, and that's, it was kind of interesting to be able to get some of these and do some research. But so each of the contractors had their folks in there. Everybody's got a dedicated function on one of these control panels. The computer readout would basically let you know how the launch test program was executing. You could smoke in there. They decided not to let people have coffee in there after there was a spill. But this is what most of the people who launched Apollo looked like. They were people pretty fresh out of college, engineers. Basically, if you showed up there and you were an engineer, you could get hired pretty quickly. Another control center that most people have never seen pictures of, and I have not seen but 3 or 4 pictures of it in actual operation, was called the ACE room. And this was over in the Spacecraft operations building. And so this was a test room that controlled the command module and the lunar module testing. They had one for the command module, one for the lunar module. And so there was a whole, as the countdown was going on out in the firing room, they also had these guys staffing the consoles in the ACE room. And so when it came down for launch day, you had a big notebook that had a computer printout of the launch program. And this is, I got to be friends with the guy who was the launch vehicle test conductor for Apollo 11. And this is a page from his Apollo 11 checklist here. So you'd go through and find your call out over the network. You had 30 channels of communication that you could communicate with various folks in the firing room or out to the launch pad. So he went through and checked off things as he went through. He said he was so concerned about making sure that he checked this off appropriately that he had somebody sitting next to him to make sure that he checked things off as he went through the process. And again, fortunately, everything went very, very swimmingly. And so if everything worked, so you've spent 6 months now getting the vehicle put together, you've tested it out, they've done a complete test with the astronauts in there, test with fueling it and then taking the fuel out to make sure that it's going to work. You've gotten approval to fly the launch vehicle, and now we come down to game day. And so one of the things that people wonder about is like, why did Kennedy Space Center turn over control to Houston at the moment of launch? And what happens is that you've got all of these connections that are made to the hardware out on the launch pad, and then it goes to the firing room. And as soon as the rocket takes off, it breaks all of those connections. And so now all of the people who were hardwired to that rocket are no longer hardwired to it. And so it's going through radio telemetry, which goes back to Houston, and also to a telemetry checking station. But basically, as soon as the rocket launched, Kennedy Space Center was done as soon as it got above the launch tower. I did get a chance to talk to some people who worked in the forward observing post there. They had a place that was much closer than where the public was allowed to go. And these guys were sitting there at the moment of launch with binoculars looking to see if there was anything unusual in the flame pattern that was coming out, or did the rocket seem to be going off in one direction or another. They had if anything looked like it was going to blow up, of course, they would call it back and then try to dive into this protective bunker, which the guy said, unfortunately, the first design was that this open pipe was facing right towards the launch pad, so it would have funneled any explosion right through towards them. So they had them turn it 90 degrees at least, but then he said it was also had a tendency to have alligators and snakes in it, and so they would really rather not jump into that if they didn't have to. But I can only imagine what it was like to be up close and personal to a Saturn V launch. And here's some footage that might give you a feel for that.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
The Saturn V was just a magnificent launch vehicle. There were two that almost didn't quite work the way they were supposed to, but otherwise completely successful. No explosions or loss of vehicle or anything like that. Just completely magnificent technology we had, way ahead of its time, and it certainly did its job. And so back in the firing room, the people watched the Saturn V take off. They're protected by shutters in case the thing did blow up. They could theoretically ride out an explosion inside the Launch Control Center. This was a famous picture right after Apollo 11, and it's been incorrectly identified as them nervously watching the launch. What I did in my research was realizing that the clock that's on here actually shows it's a little more than an hour after the launch. What they're actually nervously watching is Spiro Agnew giving them a congratulatory speech. But I wanted to point out, because a lot of people are away from their stations here. That was the other thing that was the clue that there was something else going on. But this was, you can see Deke Slayton is the one guy in there not in a suit or tie, and Alan Shepard's over there near him, and Bill Pogue, another astronaut. Watching Spiro Agnew, but in the very just left of center in this picture, you'll see this woman. This is Joanne Morgan, and I had a great opportunity to talk to her. She was the only woman working in the firing room in the Apollo 11 launch. More eventually followed in her footsteps, but she applied to NASA to be an engineer and right out of college, and they realized that there was a loophole in the hiring process. They didn't mean to be able to hire women, but there was nothing that said that she couldn't apply. So she did apply. When she started working in the blockhouses, there were no men's rooms. They had to clear there were no ladies' rooms. They had to clear the men's rooms so she could go into that. She ultimately went on to have a very senior position at Kennedy Space Center, and she's a great person, and I'm really glad to have had the opportunity to meet her. So we got to the moon. We had 6 successful landings and some other missions that were just hugely important. And again, to me, it was so wonderful to get a chance to talk to these people who made history, who didn't get the kind of publicity that they really deserved. And they were so happy that I told their story through these 2 books, which I do not have with me, but they are available. They're more technical than the other books I have, but they made me an honorary member of the launch team, and I get invited to go back to reunions when I got to go to the 50th anniversary reunion for Apollo 11, which was just a magnificent experience to get to hang out with these guys and hear their stories. But so many of them have passed away just in the short period of time since I did the interviews, that if you know anybody that worked at Kennedy Space Center, or you hear people say, my uncle worked for NASA back in those days, but I have no idea what he did, find out what he did, because it's really important to preserve that history. Well, thank you very much for coming out, ladies and gentlemen. If you have any questions, I'll meet you outside the theater afterwards. Thank you.